private methods finally, because those are things which are only of interest to the author of the class itself. Just say a little bit, and there's nothing new about this, but I just want to reinforce this, because if you're coming to Ruby as an object-oriented language, as possibly your first clean object-oriented language, then think a little bit about the relationships between variables and objects. There is an important issue, because sometimes beginners in using object orientation make a mistake which can arise in a situation like this in terms of their understanding. So there is a key difference between a variable and an object. A variable name is simply a reference to an object. So in this particular case, we've got a variable called person1, which is pointing at the string Tim, which, if you remember what I said in the earlier lecture, everything in Ruby is an object. So Tim is an object of type string. We're pointing person1 to the object Tim. We now say person2 equals person1. What that is saying is that both person1 and person2 point to the same object. There is only one instance of that object. Two variables point to the same one instance. That's important. We haven't got two things there, we've only got one thing underlying the object Tim, and we've got two variables that at this at the point immediately following that assignment statement, both variables point to the same thing. So what happens now if we assign the letter J to the first element in the string Tim, to change that to Jim, and now print out person1 is, the answer everyone will get, I hope, is that person1 is Jim, will be the line that's printed out after that print statement. Where some people get a bit confused, and give you a moment to think about what actually happens in the second one, there is in many early classes there can be a difference of about 50-50 between choice of the two possible answers. So some people will say person2 is Jim is written out, and some people will say person2 is Tim. The reasoning being that person2 was pointing at Tim and it's still pointing at Tim, but it's not. The answer is person2 is Jim, because, as I said at the beginning, person2 and person1 are variables that point to the same underlying object. We have accessed the same that one underlying object and changed the T to a J. So now both variables are referring to a single object, which now evaluates as Jim. I've gone through it in painful detail, but it is an important one. If you do want to get that alternative behavior, then this is the way in which you need to do it. You need to create a duplication of that first object and then assign the second variable to that duplicate object. So now we have one object which evaluates to Tim, and person1 is pointed to that. We have a second object created by the right hand of that second assignment statement. So person1.dup is going to duplicate that object. That is a completely separate bit of addressable memory which currently evaluates to Tim. Now we change the first letter of the object that person1 is pointing to, and we get person1 is Jim, and when we print out person2 we get the original evaluation, which is Tim. So we have two separate objects. Person 1 is pointing to one object and we've changed that object. Person 2 is pointing to a duplicate of the original object. We haven't changed that object, so we get the original evaluation out. Again, painful detail, but it's important to get that very clear in your mind. So, those are some basics of first instance variables, successor methods, setter methods, and a little bit about accessing methods in general terms, and a little bit about the importance of differentiating between a variable and the underlying object to which that variable points to. They're two different things. Let's look into the next step, which is to introduce inheritance. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about inheritance as a concept. I assume you understand that. What I want to do is just talk a little bit about how that's used and how that's implemented in Ruby. A standard example using straightforward terminology. So let's declare a parent class called parent, and there is a method say hello in there. What the say hello method is going to do is just print out something which evaluates to the object itself, which is an evaluation of the object itself. So we've got a method. It doesn't really matter what that method is. It's going to be used for an example, and now we're going to declare a subclass of that. That declaration is a little bit more succinct than you would write it in Java. An arrow or a greater than sign simply to show that child is a subclass of parent in a fairly natural way of writing it. So very succinct syntax in order to declare a subclass of parent. And then of course child will inherit all of the methods that are present in parent, and it will also inherit all of the instance variables of parent. We haven't got any declared at the moment, but let's do that. So we can declare now an instance variable name. We're not going to have any accessor methods on it for the moment. This just saves a little bit of space. So when we create a new instance of person, we can initialize the value of the instance variable to a name, and we can print out a simple statement here that says the superclass of a person is, and what we'll do here is to find from this particular case, interestingly, because it hasn't got a subclass statement in it, we will actually get a result from this. So if you want to perform some analysis on an inheritance hierarchy, all methods have a superclass, all classes have a superclass method assigned to them. They've actually inherited that superclass method from the topmost object in Ruby, which is object. And in this particular case, there isn't any explicit assignment of a superclass to person, but implicitly person inherits from object. So that final statement there will print out the superclass of person is object. And from object, person inherits a number of methods. There are some basic ones which are present. So object is an ancestor of every Ruby class. There are a number of methods declared in object which you can override. We're going to look at the toString method. So we've seen this a little bit. That's inherited down from object. It's a rather unimpressive writing out of the method. It's simply writes out the internal representation of the object. So you will normally need to override it. Let's have a look at it in the raw. We've got it here. We've got our class declaration again repeated there. Create a new instance of person. We call that Brian, and then we try to print out P. I've mentioned this a little bit earlier. If we use puts, that's going to print to the command line the object using the toString method. That's why we used printf a little while ago. Puts uses the toString method, the to_s method. In this particular case, we haven't overridden it. We're going to use the version of it that's inherited down from object, and as I said just now, that prints out the internal representation of the object preceded by the class of that object. So we've got something which is not terribly helpful, but we can of course override that, which is what we'll do now. So in this particular case, we now just write something which is a little bit of gloss on the contents or the state of a person. The state or instance variable is just name. So what we're going to do is print out a string which says the person named, and then the evaluation substitutes the evaluation of the instance variable into that string. Again, quite a lot going on in there. The hash sign telling the Ruby interpreter to evaluate the contents of the curly brackets and substitute that into the string. Simple evaluation of the name is all that's done here, so we get the person named Brian out. So relatively straightforward, but a useful thing to a useful method to be aware of. Normally you won't be using it for printing out to the end user information, but it's something which can be especially helpful when it comes to debugging your code, in having a toString method declared which enables you quickly to extract the state of an object, so that at any point you can see inside the object in a nice, succinct, easy to read way. So what we've looked at has been a slight expansion of the definition of classes. I introduced the basic syntax of a class in the earlier lecture, but we've moved on to develop that a little bit more. We've talked about instance variables and accessing and updating instance variables. We've talked a little bit about inheritance, and the next step is to start to look at Ruby on Rails in detail.